We're going to start off this segment of the lecture talking a little bit about the typefaces used in the 19th century. So what began to happen was that a lot of sans serif types were being used, and the purpose for these fonts, while they're not readable on a very small font point, when they're enlarged and used in posters, they're very attention grabbing. Oftentimes we don't realize it, but the serifs on the letters in the fonts that we're reading help us to better distinguish one letter from the other. So this was an extremely useful thing to have in posters. In the 1820s, Darius Wells invented a lateral wood router, which was a machine that allowed wood type to be mass produced. So the wood carvings in the sans serif types were actually economical and very flexible to use too. The other typefaces that were very commonly used in posters were, as you can see up here, examples of slab serif fonts. Now this, by contrast to the sans serif fonts, was also a very important feature in advertisements. But the only difference was that instead of eliminating the serifs were actually emphasized and drawn attention to. The whole aspect of this was to grab people's attention. If there was a poster or a periodical for sale along the street, it would kind of catch your eye, or something that you'd see in the periphery and you notice. So the main idea was to get things that were bold and very large, and they would just kind of pop out at you. So oddly enough, both the slab serifs as well as the sans serif types were known colloquially as Egyptians. And even though there is absolutely nothing Egyptian about these typefaces, there was a huge fascination in the Victorian times with Oriental, exotic, Egyptian paraphernalia. It even went so far that this phenomenon with being obsessed with Egypt was called Egyptomania. This poster perfectly juxtaposes both the slab serif up here as well as the sans serif type here and here. And this was for a venue next to Westminster Abbey called the Aquarium. In the 19th century, this was opened in 1876, and this was an advertisement for Cheng Wu, who was an 8-foot tall man who had become a celebrity through working in the circus, which was incidentally the Barnum and Bailey circus that you did see the advertisements to in a previous slide. What we're looking at here is called a specimen sheet, and this kind of shows the wealth of fonts that were available at the time. There was a resurgence of so-called historicist fonts that were going back to the older generations, but there were also newer things. This sort of opened up the time period for people to create their own fonts, and fortunately or unfortunately, what happened was a lot of amateurs would decide, oh hey, I'm going to make a font, and they would have that for sale, have that available, so those often got confused with the more professional and more artistic fonts out there. And as you can see in this poster, there is a very nice mixture of both two-dimensional as well as three-dimensional fonts, and you can see just such a very diverse sense of decor in these. And there's also that ornamental, elaborate ornateness coming through that is so characteristic of the Victorian century. And this stylistic sheet was created by Laurent and de Berny, and they're the two people that had a foundry for the fonts. So the important development that also came along with these typefaces was typesetting, and there were two industrial machines that could do this, called the linotype and the monotype, which was invented a year after in 1887. So these allowed the typesetters to work with a punch keyboard that directly controlled machinery for casting the hot metal type. Shown here is the monotype. So the linotype could produce an entire line of types set and justified, but the monotype used two separate machines to produce the hot type character by character, and they had their advantages and disadvantages. Because of the lines of type, linotype was great for newspapers and simple books. However, when it came to scholarly books, things that needed special diagrams and math equations and things that were a bit more complex, the linotype was not the ideal solution. So the monotype was better used for editing or for adding in things that were a little bit less traditional. And it was actually done one by one, so it had a little bit more control. At the time of these inventions, something called the American Type Founders Association, abbreviated ATF, was invented, and this created standardized prices for type, so to avoid very stark competition with pricing and stuff like that. And here we have shown one of the most famous typefaces controlled by this new ATF, and this is called Franklin Gothic. This is actually a little bit more of a modern version than is in the book, so the letters are going to look a little bit different. But this was basically a sans serif font, and this was named for Benjamin Franklin, an American printer. Morris Fuller Benton, the inventor of this type, later went on to create different versions of the type, including a condensed version and an expanded version, italic, and things that would be different from the original that you could use stylistically. And this is considered a Gothic type, but it either can be used, that term, as a sans serif type, or its opposite, black letter that looks like medieval script. So just keep in mind that the sans serif fonts, while they do look great in a large size, when they're smaller, they create strain on the eye because they're really difficult to read. It's difficult to make out the letters, and because of all the thick lines, it's just very difficult to make it out. So in Europe, grotesque is used to refer to the sans serif, while Gothic refers to the black letter type. So it's a little bit difficult to keep track of that. So there is a font called Grotesque, and this one is also a sans serif, but it's very different from the Franklin Gothic in that the letters almost look like they all fit into a line. So the bottom of the G is very compressed and almost doesn't even extend much past the middle line. So that one is a much more uniform looking font, although we don't see a lot of use of this until later on in the more modern trends. So this piece is by an artist named William Morris. It's called Minstrel with the Clarinet from 1870. What was interesting about William Morris was that he was born into a wealthy family, and he saw what was happening in the Industrial Revolution. He saw that there was this massive rise in the mass production of goods, but he noticed that these goods were starting to lack artistic integrity. They were starting to look sloppy, and less care and was given to the attention to detail. Morris sought to remedy this for anything from furniture to books. He decided that design was very crucial to the integrity of a product. Morris took it upon himself to make it his life's work to improve the quality of British design. The English writer John Ruskin, born in 1819, asserted that basically the decorative arts were more important in mundane objects such as furniture and wallpaper, things that you see every day. It was more important to see great design in everyday objects than necessarily going to a museum and seeing these beautiful works of art on the wall. So this is the stuff that's going to surround us every day, and he figured, well, it may as well look great and may as well enhance our perception of our everyday life and serve as a constant. Morris took his mission even more seriously than the people that were glamorizing the older styles, in that he wanted to beautify the world around him. He wanted to add color and design into the everyday life of the industrial worker. He was particularly concerned about helping the people who were working in the mills and the factories, and he wanted to help them have more beauty and more satisfaction out of their lives through design. He even saw art as important as having freedom or education, which was interesting too. The only thing that was downfall was that his work was actually expensive to own and was, as a result, reserved for mostly the wealthy elite. However, he did have a lot of concern for the plight of the workers. However, those same workers were unable to afford the products that he created. William Morris's work became known as the arts and crafts style. This was a direct response to the ornateness of the Victorian era, and you can see a lot of clean lines in his Sussex chair. It's just a very simple and very elegant solution to furniture, although it is not mass produced. He saw furniture as something that should be made by craftsmen and not automated by machines in a factory. Morris also believed that designers should be skilled in creating the production of their product as well as the design. So a lot of times today you'll see someone who is just a designer and someone else actually carries out the work to the finished product. They actually fashion the object. Part of the arts and crafts movement was similar to the medieval times in that not only could you envision such a beautiful object, you also had the means to create it to its specific specifications. This is a scene from Nature of Gothic from 1892. It was a text that Morris admired very much, and he produced a few hundred copies of this book with the same historicist design that he used in the stained glass of the minstrel with the clarinet. So now not only was William Morris a furniture designer, he also expanded his business to work with printing books, and this was called Kelmscott Press. So once again, Morris didn't enjoy the way things were done at the time, so he used handmade paper and very high quality leather covers on these books. This ultimately wound up being a book that was designed for people who enjoyed books for their aesthetic qualities, namely bibliophiles. So this is something that you wouldn't just read and get through it and toss it around. This was, a very well crafted book. And so because he put so much labor into the things, he ultimately never wound up addressing the problem of the industrial lifestyle. So he did critique it and he aimed to go beyond it, but what happened was his work still was such a commodity reserved for the very wealthy. So with the rise of mass media in the 19th century, it is often difficult to tell whether or not design had become more prevalent because, yes, it's true that there is more need for printed materials and graphics. It is arguable that just because someone was able to create those, that they were in fact designing. So it was probably around this time that graphic design came into its own, although there was a huge range in terms of quality between printed materials. Some things were worked very hard on, very laborious efforts that turned out beautiful and were created in these boutique design houses. But then again, the ultimate idea here was to get the word out and reach as many people as possible. So you get such a wide range in terms of quality of design in this century. So the question remains is if this stuff is a little bit gaudy and if it's just kind of thrown together, or if there were in fact some things that had a conscious effort to look composed and compositionally pleasing. So yeah, that is the 19th century.